You bumette.
Pardon?
You're a bumette.
I'm a bumette, yes. Yes, I'm a bumette.
You work too much.
Well, that never has changed in so many years. I'm not sure how to fix it. Okay. Yeah, Dave, this room has candy.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that.
Rudiger made a claim later that earlier, there were places in Germany where people actually laugh all the time. And I told him,
Really?
I want to go and see this.
That would be good. Be good. Folks, what some people have experienced is sitting in the back half of the room, you miss the speakers. Somehow this room in the back, you may not hear as well. Just so you know, you may sit in the back and slip in and out. I won't feel bad if you're in the front and you slip in and out. It doesn't matter, but just.
But if you snore,
Yeah.
we will throw something at you. We don't care if you sleep, just if you snore, we will throw.
Yeah, but just so you know, if you're sitting back there, the sound is really bad in this room. It somehow gets here and you can't hear. So, and if you have to go in the middle, I won't mind at all. Just so you know. Wait till you get a minute here. Okay, would anyone like to volunteer to work on the even path? This will improve your return on minutes, but we'll hope the report.
I see the massive number of volunteers.
Yeah, I see that
It's
too,
like,
but, you know, be nice to the volunteers, they run away. Okay. I will repeat this comment one more time because I've sat in this room 3 times. If you sit back of this sort of post, the sound may be bad. If you're worried about being insulted, if you walk in and out, I won't be insulted at all. I'm just trying to be friendly about what you can hear. You'll probably have me announce this one more, but I got stuck in the back corner and couldn't hear on one of the meetings I was in.
Maybe next time say that mic.
Oh, you already said the microphone.
yeah, so that people.
Okay, can everybody hear me? How about the back? I had one of the mumblers at the mic then. Is everything working okay in the back? Good. Okay, they fixed it. Good news. Are we at 350 or are we at 4?
350. This is a kind of small crowd though. I think that each of you needs to go out and find 4 other people to bring in.
That's okay. Are you ready to go? We'll go with the tape then. Okay, we're going to start as we're the meeting that's between you and beer and dinner. So I'm going to go through the agenda and then and the chair slides, unless you wanted to do it. I can do them both. Okay, so it's Alex, you're up. Has anyone seen Mark so far? Okay, he may not make it. He had another meeting. Am I too loud now? Okay. So the agenda, they've written the note well again. Please read it, enjoy it, love it. How many people have never seen a note well? Okay, well then, please read it. They're online. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to bash the agenda and we'll go through the chair status. Being as it's late, we may run a little later into the chair status time, but we have a fairly short set of model reviews. The data models we're going to go through. The topology drafts went to the ISG and came back because the revised data store issues had not been finished. Now that NetMod has kindly finished stuff and given us good advice, and the TOTIS group has worked. Alex will give a brief update. Mark went through his data model and info model to see if there were revised data stores. We haven't had it checked on Yang models, but if he's not here, I will give a brief check. Then we will go through some new models, Fabric Data Center and CU separation models. And then most of this session was to see if we had interest in a design team for a ephemeral data store. I will go through a description of that, and then I will call for volunteers. Then at that point, we will break out into working on a design team, because I figured most people, the ephemeral data stores, probably just so simple we might be able to finish it at this time. Or we might be able to get a good long way. Then our next session was set aside for a data store to get a room, but they gave us a large room. So if I get a data center team. Now, I'll go right into the chair slides on that, because what's important, just a minute, I've lost the chair slides.
There.
I got it.
Yeah.
You got the chair. Yeah,
The
got it.
chair.
Okay, I might as well just go right into the chair slides. What we're doing is we're at the end of our two major models. Our major models are our network model and our Yang topology model. We think that this is all done. I think the RIB data model has to the 25th to make a comment, but these are about ready to go once we've checked with the Yang doctors and Opster and Routinger for their QAs, and these will go carefully. I will be asking, at least at my input from the TEAS working group and people, for an early RFC publication if the ISG approves of the topology, so the TEAS work can go through and several others. The RIB model will probably go through at normal speed, but there are implementations of large size coming. Remember, these models can go into configuration or dynamic data store. They are simply models. They are designed to be ready for dynamic data store and have been implemented in it. I think I've said everything on this slide. This little thing is congratulations to the working group for having gotten through the big major models we were chartered through. I know that we've had a lot of, and congratulations to the NetMod and NetComp for all their help. Okay. Now, the AD's request is to adjust the milestones and plans. We can, if I have a design team that works on ephemeral state and work that might fit in with it, then we will keep going. If not, we may go and wait for some of the implementation reports or go into a short hiatus. There's lots of stuff, but I need to make sure that as we plug in additional models, we have a data store to plug in. And there is a template for this, thanks again to the authors of the revised data store, Kent being one and several others, that there's a template. So, I'm going to go through as the last step the template and the issues. If we have a short design team, this, because of all the good work, may be a short form, or we may have to argue with some of the things. So looking for that design team, if you're looking for a quick turn, that's what we're doing. Our choices in our list are, again, work on the ephemeral state, work on the new models for specific deployments, and wait for more implementations. At the end of all the models, I will show the network data store model. Actually, at the end of all the models, I'll take a pause and ask for people if they have any opinion. Then we'll go into the revised data store model, and for those people who want to work on it. If there's no one that want to work on it, that will take us into the go on hiatus while we finish everything. Questions? This is really a time of choice. If the working group says, okay, we've done everything and the information in the revised data stores is enough for corporations to develop their own, that's great. We've done a good job at setting everything up and doing the pub sub and getting the push and getting these basic models. I'm sure this stuff will come back as we get other use cases, and in fact, some of the BOFs have suggested that might be good. Kent?
Kent Watson, Juniper Networks. Not so much a question, but as a comment. I'm still the assigned gang doctor for the topology draft, and I'll be looking into it shortly after the conference. So,
Good, thank you. Aaliyah, I went through the chair slides already, my apologies. Now we're going to, Alex, it's your turn. Yeah, he's going to do it next week. Apologies. Well,
Okay, so hi everybody. I just have a very brief update regarding the topology. So there are two drafts. One is the basic topology model. The second is the layer 3 topology model. Next slide, please. So basically, there have been a few updates. So the topology model went from the 12 to the 14, and the layer 3 topology model from the 8 to the 10 draft. The main update, probably the most important update is that we changed and updated the model to NMDA compliance. This was also in particularly to address the mixed discovered underlays and configured overlays issue that we've struggled with for such a long time, and this was basically the cleanest resolution. So basically, I'm glad actually that worked out. The structure of the model actually has remained the same. Actually, the changes were actually very minimal. Basically, the only change, other than the description and the textual updates, was that the server-provided leaf is gone. Then in addition, there was in the latest revision, we did add also a state model for non-NMDA compliant implementation. That was a comment that was made, I think, by Rob Wilton. I think brought it up that it would be a good idea to add that. So we have this actually in there as well. We moved those to the appendix because this is basically just for the non-NMDA compliant implementations. And yeah, so the updated models have been reviewed, but of course we'll be happy to get your review, Kent. And also, I wanted to mention also that the security considerations have also been updated and reviewed. Basically, it does explain basically the fact that we rely on the underlying transport and NACM to provide security. In addition, basically, we have added basically explanation of various exploits that you could do if you were to mess with configuration if you did not have that access. Okay, next one. And so, basically, the next steps are, well, essentially, the network topology draft is done, we hope. The layer 3 topology draft is practically done. It doesn't require actually one more revision with very minor updates. There was also another young doctor, I think Christian Hobbs, raised actually the issue that we have in the example model, which is not actually part of the model per se, but in the example, we have basically we show how to apply to I2RS, and basically we were advised that and also there was basically actually one issue that basically one prefix needs to be updated to point to the correct state model. Those things are minimal, and we hope to post them in the coming few days, also by the end of the week. Okay, that's all.
Thank you. So again, this is past its working group last call, but at any point, if you're implementing or deploying it, please send comments. It will go to IETF last call fairly quickly after the Yang doctors go. So thank you again to all who've worked on it. Okay, now we're on to the RIP model. And Mark, do you want to give that one just a minute?
Okay, this is a very brief update to this I2RS RIP information model and RIP model. And this two draft has already been there for a long time and quite stable. They also believe, and these two drafts align with each other. And there's no additional changes since 2 years before. The information model has already passed the working group last call, and the data model has already last call has already started. And we also very appreciate the comments and suggestions to the model, and also have to do a very quick check on the draft, on the data model draft. I personally think that draft is capable with the NMDA style. So that's all for the draft.
And again, we look for our gang doctor has responded. It's Giles, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he's starting to interact with Mark. So
Yeah.
we are, again, thankful for that.
Okay.
Any questions about this? Again, it's the same comment. This is going to go rapidly through the process. If you have looked at it or played with it or have anything to say, please make comments. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for all your hard work, and big thank you to Nitin out there in the blue internet space that we can, he's been so faithful to keep going with this all these years. Okay, now we're going to go through the new models. These have not been adopted or called to. We're going to talk about them, fabric-based.
Hello, everyone. Now here come to the two models focusing on the fabric-based management for data center network. The first one is about the network topology, and another is the service model. As these two models have been presented for several times, so I may give a brief introduction about these two models. Next slide, please. The objectives. The service model is defined to represent the services for the users in order to deploy the service, while regardless of the details of the network, such as the topology, technology, and many others. While the fabric-based topology model is used to define a fabric topology module to manage the data center network. In architecture, we give the usage of these two models. The fabric service model is used by the orchestrator to communicate with the topology manager in order to deploy a service, while the fabric topology model is used by the topology manager in order to manage the network. The next slide, please. Here is the history of these two models. The fabric topology model is firstly proposed in IETF 96 in Berlin, while in IETF 97, we updated the fabric topology model due to the comments. And besides, we also proposed the fabric service model as the service interface to users to configure or manage the user network fabric topology. Besides that, in the fabric service model, we also define an architecture. In the architecture, we explain how these two models to cooperate together in order to provide a service. Besides that, we also add new authors in order to participate in the work. While last IETF in Chicago, we resolved the comments on comparing the fabric model with the TE topology model. After discussion with the TE topology authors, we both make the consensus on the difference between these two models. Besides that, we add some descriptions and revise the models based on the comments. Next slide, please. And after the IETF 98, we also make some updates on these two models. Firstly, due to the recommendation by the area directors, we also update the models to network management database architecture style. And also in the appendix, we provided a non-NMDA fabric topology state module. Besides that, as people show more interest in fabric modules, so we remove the content of the fabric capable device module, as this module is independent with our two modules, the fabric topology module and the service module. Besides that, we'll also make some editorial changes. Next slide, please. After this update, we think that now these two drafts are ready for the work group adoption. So we may ask what the chairs recommend about the adoption. And also we appreciate for the further review of these two model drafts.
And thank you for that question. We'll pick it up after the next model as part
Okay.
of our general discussion. We
Okay.
do appreciate all your hard work to refine the model.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
And next is the question.
Any questions? Good, we'll go on to the next model. Thank you
Okay.
again. We will pick up some general questions I introduced at the beginning of the session after this next model and before we go into the discussion on ephemeral data store. Thank you again.
Okay, next model.
Michael, it's your turn. Yes. I'll be flipping your slides for you today, so just.
Okay. Hi, working group. This is Michael from Huawei, and today I want to introduce the update for information module of a CO-separated network. Okay. This is slide is briefly introduce background, motivation, and objective of our works. The background is CO-separated BNJ network use case and architectures already accessed by BBF's Cloud CO working group, and the relative document will introduce strawberry steps and maybe will be published in this years. And so why we need to use this CO-separated BNJ network is because it can bring many benefits. For example, if we have the synchronized control plane, that the control plane can have the whole view of the network resource and the user's information. So this control plane can distribute the network resource as a specific service requirement. For example, the control plane can balance distribute the IP and session to the user plane. That can improve the utilization of network resource. And another benefit is if we have the synchronized control plane, that it can provide a unified interface to outside systems such as EMS, DHCP server, and readers. This can simplify the management. Also, this work can magnificently reduce the time to market because the control plane and the user plane be separated, and the device of them can be extended separated. So it can significantly reduce time to market. The last things we can get benefit is because some BNG network and anytime maybe have a large number of user accessing. So if we have a dynamic control plane to handle it, it will improve the efficiency to the network. Okay, so how to achieve this CO-separated network? In this document, we provide an information module to present the interaction interface between the control plane and the user plane. If this work be standardized, it can help the interaction work between interwork between different devices. For example, if the control plane devices is from winter A and the user plane devices from winter B, C, D, and if we have a standard information module that can help them to understand each other and help them understand and recognize what's the attribute this table carried. So this information module basically have two blocks. One is introduce control planes interface, control planes information. Another is can introduce user planes information. The control planes is Charge-off generate some interest tables, rules, and then send to the user plane. And the user plane will map into some policy and then perform corresponding action. Another rules of the user plane is to report the traffic statistic to the user to the control plane. And next slide we provide an example of this information model. Okay, we can see in this picture there is even maybe a user named Bob. He is accessing, and then you can see the left figure. The user plane will report the Bob's information and the traffic statistic, for example, the available bandwidth to the control plane. Control plane receives this information and then search the Bob's corresponding service requirement, then auto-generate some tables. For example, the user's information table. It can help to the user plane. Okay, this set of tables is relative to the Bob, and the Bob's source IPv4 information and the Bob's QoS requirement. For example, here is provide example. The CIR is 6 MB per second, PIR is 8 MB per second, and then the user control plane sends several rules to the user plane. User plane receives these rules and mapping to corresponding policies. And here is some policy example. The rules is if Bob is an engineer and the source IP is in the market subnet, and then it performs corresponding action is okay. Limited Bob's bandwidth from 6 MB to 10 MB. Then the user plane performs this action. Next slide, please. Okay, this page provides update from last night meeting, and in the 0.1 version, we are writing the user's information module and user plane's information module correct some clerical errors and improve the readability. Here is a figure to show the briefly introduce the user plane, the behaviors. The user plane receives the rules and mapping policy, and then perform corresponding actions. And another thing we update is we add an AppDex section to introduce the data model of the CU separate BNG network. Here we reuse the data model which defined in the RTGWG working group, the logical network element and the logical and the network instance module. And here we can see this is a tree structure. We use an example. We create an instance of the IONE module. You can see here the name. The name we assign a value VBRAS 1, and then it can use schema-among mechanism to assemble different relative works such as interface, VLAN, policy, QoS, ACL. And in this meeting, we also want to get some feedback, and some experts maybe can told us whether this is a good way or right way to use this module to present the CU-separated data model. Okay. Next. Okay. The next step we want to align with the BBF or relative works, and maybe requires the BBF chairs and cross-CU working group chairs to send some liaison to I2RS working group. And we also want to solicit more comments and suggestions, and we can, based on this suggestion or comments, to prepare another variant to improve our works. Finally, if everything works well, and the working group think this is a valuable works, maybe we want sometime we can want working group co-adoption. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And again, we're going to cover some of these adoptions in our general questions. So any questions for Michael? Well, thank you. We will go on to the next step. Again, I'm going to repeat what we started out in the chair slides is our major work item left is to create ephemeral or a dynamic data store. That was our initial charter. Of course, with the dynamic data store, we could create one that's not. In our wonderful NetMod revised data store version 3, there is a appendix which provides a great deal of the information. You should see the example ephemeral state that Kent and his co-authors provided, and there's a wonderful extension. Now, we can go through and continue to work on that, but we need a design team. So right now, we're going to do what we lovingly call the hum moment. I would like to hear a hum on people who want to work on this revised data stores. Work means be an author, be a reviser.
Alternatively, you can pull out your IETF app and swipe right.
Yes, swipe right. We won't go. So the chair would like a hum. Will all those who are willing to work on the ephemeral data store, that means co-author or revise, hum. Okay, that's a small set of hums. The next question is are people interested in the last two models? We'll go model by model. I'd like a hum on people who are willing to active. The authors have spent quite a bit of time working on their model. How many people? Go ahead,
Sorry,
Kent.
Before you get to the Kent Watson Juniper Networks, before we get to the hum, at least on the last model, I was wondering, is the I2RS working group the appropriate working group for that work? I mean, is it related to ephemeral dynamic data stores?
Again, this is a place like RTWG where models can come to find a home.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be ephemeral. It doesn't have to be dynamic, and simply be a platform-wide, not a specific protocol, or protocol independent. So in that hat, the fabric model fits. So we'll ask that question, and then for Michael's, we have a secondary question. So I will ask the question because that will help the AD and I, and Russ and Ali and I, to direct the authors to their best next step. How many people are interested in working on the fabric? I've asked the room to have a hum if you're interested. Okay, so we do hear some interest. That's a sort of Well, you're hearing it probably better than I. Okay, for Michael's draft and his wonderful co-authors, that's the one. Michael, did you present in RDWG as well?
No.
Yes, okay. What was your feedback there? Okay. So one of the questions someone asked about his model, and I want to make sure if we need discussion, is whether it's specific, is it protocol independent model? Michael makes the proposal that the split between control plane and user plane is interesting and a non-protocol specific model. Other people have suggested that it may be aligned with other things such as the BBF because of his application. Again, the reason why it's here is not necessarily that it's ephemeral or dynamic, although you can see the benefit of that for his model, but because it's protocol independent. So I'm going to ask for a sense of the room. By the way, we will send these to the list as well, but as a sense of the room for the AD and Russ and I, how many people are interested in reviewing this model? I'd ask for a hum. Okay, Ilya, you hear our answer. Was that a medium or was that a high for the note taker? Medium, high? That was medium. Okay. That's energized. Good. Okay. So that is the chairs. Because of that, we'll get together and send the authors what we're going to do as far as making a working group call. Unless you want to, yeah. Please do.
So I'm really happy to hear that there's interest in additional work and models, but one of my questions is getting the base pieces done and having the energy and participation and need in terms of implementations, for instance, to do so. And so for that, I mean, I personally feel like there's a lot of value in the RIB models and the topology models. One of the questions is for other pieces of work that the working group's been working on, like the filter-based RIB, the interest level in that. I have talked with the chairs about looking at winding down the working group if there's not enough energy and if we're not having folks actually actively volunteering to do things like shepherd and review documents. I know that part of the challenge in this working group has been that a lot of the documents are there. Sorry, I'm being blunt. A lot of the challenge. I'm just going to go up here so people can actually see me. Let's try this again so you can actually see me and not blocked by a column. Right. One of the challenges has been that a lot of the documents have been sitting there for a year or two, and we haven't had necessarily all of the pieces, such as some of the ephemeral data store work, in order to do full implementation, as full or at least standards compliant for what it will be implementations. And so one of the questions I have is how many people, of course now I can't hear the helm as well either, how many people are willing and interested to seriously, work on things like the data store, reviewing documents, and so on in the next 6 months. If I can have a hum for that, that would be useful.
Okay, so that was a hum for if you're willing to work and review the ephemeral data store.
Well, I was actually asking in general for the work, because I think that what I found interesting is that was actually different and less than the people who are interested in some of the new documents. Bluntly, I'm extremely concerned about the idea of trying to adopt new documents in the working group if there's not energy in the working group, because there are other places, if we need to, that we could put them, right? I'd like to see the work that's in the working group get done. We've done a lot of stuff. When we started this working group, we thought, wow, if we could just get data models, just getting the RIB data model, get some of this stuff done, that would be huge and a big change for the industry. And I think we've seen a lot of that happen already. A lot of the features that we were looking for to go into NetConf and RESTConf are there. It's awesome. But the question is, at what point do we say, that was great, but now we don't have energy? Or at what point do we say, this was great, and now we're really gung-ho to go focus on this piece? And that's what I need you all to be thinking about. My understanding is the ephemeral data store work, to actually do that, particularly if we have some productive sessions this week, is not that high. But I really need to have, one of the question I'm facing is, do I recharter or do I close I2RS, and when do I do it? And that's based on, interest and energy. This is not a, I want to close I2RS. This is a, if this is what the status is, that's what it is, and I need to know that. Hey, Phil.
Phil Schaefer, Juniper Networks. If you're looking for a more accurate thing, you might want to have people stand up, because there's a deniability in a hum, But you stand up and actually raise your hand, something.
Sure, that's fine.
Get a more accurate, more less deniable count.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. So fine. Who in the working? Well, sorry, Don, do you want to go first?
Yeah, Dan Bogdanovic. So the working group from the original architecture document fared far away. And the original intent, what was in the architecture and what is being developed today are two different things. So from that perspective, me personally, I'm coming here to see if there's something coming back, but so far, from my perspective, from the original intent and what the working group went to, ended up in very, differentiated. So if you remember, you were even the author on the document, you and David Ward, on the original architecture document.
Yes, I'm very well aware.
So,
I would argue actually the push notifications, the ability to do dynamic pushes and subscriptions are one of the pieces there. We have an understanding of how to actually do the priorities to handle multi-headed control, and that's there. We have the dynamic data store understood what needs to happen, but not nailed down yet. We have the RIB model, which lets us provide a programmatic interface at the right level. If you're talking about speed issues, sure, that's a concern. If you're talking about all of the other pieces in terms of sort of dynamic to the different protocols,
so I will
we've had
say-
challenges.
So I will go to that. I have experience implementing something which is close to I2RS,
Yes.
but it is essentially not compliant with the majority of the documents. One of the things which I ran into it that there were some issues that they had to go different ways and different paths. So some of the things are useful, but majority of the things are a little bit problematic. So I'm keeping an eye on it, but I am not doing active contributions because it's the path is diverged. That's all.
A point of clarification. If we had netmod, netconf and resconf were two initial pieces. As we announced in the last couple things, people with an alternative, be it binary, be it CBOR or whatever you have, are still open. Are you suggesting something like you'd like to see something like that with yet another alternative?
Not necessarily. It would be nice, but not necessarily, because it's more about the interactions between the applications, how I see the I2RS is useful between the management, service, control, and data plane, and and especially with the breaking up of the data plane and the control plane, and the control plane separation, of the control plane, data plane, the data plane, and service plane. Those were interesting part where some of the I2RS concepts can be used, and you can use netconf, resconf, or anything third party. It doesn't matter, because in this case, like for example, the RIB model is a common thing. Now, which transport you use to transfer the API between the point A and B, I don't think it's this important. It's more about agreeing on, on the applications. For example, one of them is, we were having that chat today. For example, is I want to do an LSP, and from a usage perspective is how I want to use the LSP, or how I want to use the ACL, and then define that here. How is it being used, and what API what an API to do in order to communicate that desire. I don't want to, on purpose, I don't want to use the word intent. So your desire to that being essentially through the control plane being established and deployed onto the data plane. So coming up with those use cases and saying, okay, here are my, here's my common LFIP, here's my, common, RIB, just that would be a very useful. And then which protocols you're using, it really doesn't matter.
So what I'm hearing, just to reflect back, unless you want to address something else to Leah, I just want to clarify your comments. Did you want to go ahead for something to Leah before I ask
No,
clarifying
that was just
clarifying
general.
question? Then it sounded like the data plane application plane split that Michael was looking at was something of interest to you.
If you can mention the draft name, I cannot put.
Michael, would you?
No, but what was the draft name? Oh, okay. So I haven't read that draft, so I can't do a full comment on that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I know, but I haven't
Okay.
read the full draft, so I can't.
Thank you very much. That was just a clarifying question.
Well, I guess the question is more use cases, but more to the point, as you say, you have an implementation and what we've been doing here is diverged. Are there other people, and feel free to raise hands or come up to the mic, who are in similar boats? Are there pieces that have been implemented and it just feels like this is not, has not been going down the right path? Okay, so let me pull back. So your contributions are welcome. The intent was not to go down the different path. And if we don't understand what the divergence is, it's hard to improve it. Running code really matters. That said, but let me go back to Phil's point, which is, all right, raise your hand or stand up if you're willing to work on documents in the next 6 months to get different pieces done.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So I'm not going to try it. I mean, if I2RS were to continue for a long period of time, then I would be looking at doing things like rechartering to add in some of the pieces that we talked about in some of the netconf, netmod recharter to clarify the pieces that need to happen. But we've got, an agreement, and I'm happy to at least let things run through the next IETF and see how things go. But we really need to actually have energy in motion. I know that some of the models, like the topology stuff, are things that certain projects are depending on, and we're not really seeing folks coming and participating and saying, hey, this is what we need. A lot of energy has been put into the working group by, Sue is one of the chairs, and that's not something that's fair to depend on, and it doesn't represent the group, right? I need you all who raised your hand to be active reviewers and active drivers. We can't have a single motive force in the working group. That's not functional.
Okay.
I think
Thank
I'm
you
done.
very much.
Thanks.
Aaliyah has the input. Now, the next step we're going to do is, for those who've raised your hand who want to work on the ephemeral data store, for the model people, I think Aaliyah and I will get back to you on that. I apologize for this pause here, but we will get back to you within a day or so. And if you're here the rest of the week, we'll try to meet with you individually. So we really appreciate your hard work. And Michael, I think you heard that you have someone to talk to about it.
Sorry, Aaliyah, let me just clarify. Clearly, there's interest in both of the models and the work. The question is not, should the work proceed? Sue, of course, understood this. The question is, should it proceed here, or would it make more sense for it to happen in RTGWG due to the, if we're trying to work on heading to finishing up the work in I2RS, then it might make more sense to do in RTGWG. So this is a management issue, not a reflection on the coolness of the drafts or the interest in them.
And that you should see as a positive thing for your drafts. There's actually good interest, and Aaliyah and I are being very careful to make sure, Aaliyah and Russ and I are very careful to make sure your drafts are finding a good place, because we are hearing interest. So you should hear that as a positive. Thank you, Russ. Okay, the next part of this working group is really a working session. So for those people who raised your hand, come up to the front. We're going to sit down and talk about the ephemeral data store. The rest of you are welcome, but this is really this session, and we may schedule another session on Thursday as a working session. So if you raise your hand, come up toward the front. We'll just sit and start working on this ephemeral data store.
They didn't know there was a test when they raised their hands.
Okay, Russ, you get to run.
So you've got the whiteboard and all, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, come on. So I'm going to start with the ephemeral data store. If you're interested, come toward the front if you raise your hand, and we're going to just start to talk about things.
So people can start writing stuff down.
This is going to be hard to take notes for, you know.
That's okay.
That's okay, it doesn't have to take
That's
notes.
why you take pictures at the end.
Okay, so you're going to have two functions here where we have ephemeral data store. This basic, by the way, Jurgen, just so I say thank you, you're one of the authors. Thank you very much for the care. You did your normal excellent work here along with Kent. Thank you. You just did a fabulous job with this stuff. Okay, folks, in this revised data store, and Kent can help us, this is a basic model. You know, we could take off example IETF ephemeral model and just simply put, wait, first let me take a step back. One of the things that Jan, very helpful, asked me in email is, what about ephemeral data store and dynamic data store? I hope it was clear that ephemeral data store is a subset of dynamic data store. Not everything is ephemeral, right? The ephemeral source.
Well, sorry, Kent Watson. I thought they were synonyms for each other, that we had just moved from to the term dynamic, so it wasn't specific to.
The question, some people said, and this is part of the discussion, part of the model design, is ephemeral is a particular thing that says when you reboot, the information goes away. Poof goes the magic information. It is not clear that in dynamic data stores, that is a capability that has to happen with dynamic data stores. You could store dynamic data store in non-volatile RAM. Okay, so that's where you laid it out. So ephemeral and you made it the same.
Well, so the draft says anything that's written to the dynamic data store is ephemeral. The draft doesn't preclude you having a data model where you can write entries in the data model through the dynamic data store, and those are ephemeral. And in theory, you could configure entries in that same data model through conventional data stores,
Okay.
and those would be persistent.
Let's go with the simple case. We're just going to say they're synonyms and stop. I had to raise the issue by question. So we're only going to consider, Jan, thank you for the question. It was excellent in email. It is only ephemeral, okay? So this example that they have, we could say IETF ephemeral, I2RS ephemeral, whatever the appropriate thing is. Probably since it's IETF, it should start. We can go with the namespace. We can give a list. We can import the data store. We can import the origin. Did anyone have any problems with the origin pieces that were listed in the revised data store? By the way, do I have someone who wants to be a lead editor on this draft? Am I getting a volunteer? That's one of the things Ali is looking for. Do we have a lead volunteer for the editing? Not seeing a hand. That's a little worrisome, both Ali and I. Okay. This ephemeral identity then becomes part of the data store, and the origin can be from the base of the dynamic. Okay, there is an argument value, and Kent, what were you intending for this argument value? I didn't pick this up in NetMod.
So we're actually outside of the working group meeting now. I don't.
Yes.
I don't have to say my name every time.
No, you don't. This is a design team.
Okay, great.
Yeah, this is just,
Right. So the data store authors are in the process of discussing the need for this extension statement, and actually we're beginning to think that maybe it's not necessary.
okay.
We're trying to formulate a final conclusion to it, but the whole question is, do we really want it to have config false ephemeral true, or could the data model just be a standard config true, but it's only available inside the specific dynamic data store.
And-
So-
Explain what that would
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah. Okay. So
It's on the previous slide.
Yeah,
Pointed out that. It's your
it was
point you-
second to last, or second to the top line, I think it was the
line 3 there.
config false ephemeral true. Yeah, so okay, so at the time that this was written, that's what we thought, but then in the interim, we came out the Yang library biz
Mhm.
document, and if you look at that, there's basically a list of modules, which could include standard configuration modules and also I2RS modules if you like, and then, okay, and then there's a list of module sets, and then lastly, a list of data stores. The data stores would be things like running, candidate, and then potentially ephemeral, I2RS ephemeral.
Mhm.
Each of those data stores then have a pointer into which module sets they're using, which of course then are which modules they're using. So what this means is you could have a module and a server could say, I only implement it inside the ephemeral data store.
And that might be very useful.
Right. And then, of course, then that means the config true nodes would, it's obvious that these are going to reflect the dynamic updates. So then in that scenario, you wouldn't have to have this config false ephemeral true, which in some ways seems different. I mean, it would go against the grain of some basic tools like ping, your output.
Yes, and
everything looks
I like that environment.
So we're still in the process of kind of sifting through whether or not we really want that idiom, config false ephemeral true, versus just having standard config true, but the module's only available in the specific data store.
The question is for the RIB info model.
Yeah.
Or for the topology
Yeah,
model.
so the RIB Yang model today in the draft has it as config true, right?
Right.
Has all your leaves as config true.
I'm glad you said that because I was in the process of reviewing it. I was wondering if it was ready.
It's config true, and I believe the topology model was config true as well.
And you intend to be able to edit them dynamically?
Yes.
Okay, so then that kind of tilts the hat, if you will. Tilts the tables.
So I think the remaining question is there any cases you have where you think there's data that's config false, sort of state data, like fib entries maybe, for example?
There are in fib entries as defined 1 or 2 state values. That is, hi, I installed a route. Oh, yes, it really happened. So that's operational. That would be if it was just in a config one.
Dynamic operational state. It's not like. It's just, I mean,
So
So if you install it, if the RIB model is used in a straight configuration model, that is obvious.
Yeah.
What you're really asking is if you instantiate this in an ephemeral state, what happens, right?
what I'm
considering there are 2 applications that both want to, that are, one, okay, and I can use like a BGP example or something, where one is reliant on the next hop provided in the routing table. It's actually, the next hop route is installed by another process. So the process, first application installs the route. The second application needs to know that that route was installed. That's like, typical operating procedure. for
Right.
Control plane protocol.
Right now, the GROW working group is doing something very like it in what one call, not with all the netmod stuff, because they can't do it. They want to install a route, and then they want to be able to read it back to make sure they got there. And it's, in their definition, that's dynamic, it blows away. So that's an example of a working group doing it in a less than optimum thing because the stuff isn't ready.
So I think my question is slightly different. It's or maybe it's the same, I don't know, but it's if you have some data that you naturally in the Yang model mark as config false, is there any of that data that you want to write to?
No,
So everything
I can't think of a one.
if everything you're going to write to is something you think is something that could be configured normally, potentially, and is reasonable to mark as config true, then that's useful to know.
Every time we've done something like that, we've regretted it.
I hate to use, the problem is I hate to use the word configure, but yes, it would
Oh.
be installed.
Or configurable, or
Something
yeah,
like that.
yes.
It would be state that you would write to rather than just reading.
Yeah.
Yes, that I think is clearly delineated even in all the models.
Yes.
okay.
Just to clarify a little bit, because I think, Rob, I think you're talking about configurable through standard data stores. Whereas you might be talking about writable in general,
Yes.
as in through the dynamics,
Yes.
through the I2RS protocol.
Yeah.
It'd be a little bit, a little bit
To
clearer.
give you an example, there are likely to be things in I2RS models that do not exist in other models, that were not exposed. But if they're writable, they're writable. We're not going to say they're config false, but we have to write them anyway. So you're not going to take something that is config false in some other model and make it config true here. We at least haven't found any case we need to do that. But there are certainly going to be things that simply don't exist in the regular data store.
I think that's okay. I mean, I think having the option of having some config true stuff that's only applicable to I2RS, I think that's okay. It's more the question of semantically what's configuration and state. It's all a bit woolly anyway, but I think that Yang, config true is what people think of as configuration, config false is stuff that isn't. And it's just trying to get that balance. Is there stuff that is really just state you want to modify dynamically? So something like some session state that you'd never be marked as configurable because it's dynamically learnt from the running network. So you can't define it as config. It's not something that's configurable.
So we'll use BGP and we'll use the LSP example. The BGP example where you would write over something, everyone who's done that has usually found a place where it went bump in the night and caused a bad problem.
Okay.
And then, I mean, there are many things like you
That's
can
good.
do that are not configuration that people have tried. And every time I've heard of that, I've usually heard of a major incident
Okay.
caused by it. It's a bad idea. Let's just stop. I agree.
Okay.
They have done that, but don't go there. It usually goes really badly crash at some point in life.
But it almost feels like this is outside the config true false.
Yes.
It's like not, whatever you set it to is, it's ephemeral data. It's not, or state, it's not like, I'm not sure how the config true, config false even, I don't know how to get my mind around. Well, there are things which we are going to define in our models for reading purposes, which we don't expect anybody to set. Yes. That's config false rather than config true.
Yep.
The fact whether it's really config, forget the word config is that.
It's read or write data. Okay?
Ish.
I know what
Ish.
Yang has a- this is the term, I'm not saying it's wrong. We like ish. In routing, we're very good with ish.
Okay.
That's a
Have-
good
have
song,
we-
ish.
Phil, this is a good time to just sit and chat about this. I agree with that.
These are configurations that will never connect.
Well, does I2RS intend, like, obviously you intend to write rib entries through the I2RS protocol
We intend
into
to
the
write to
dynamic
rib.
data store. That's fine, and read.
Right,
Do
read,
you
and-
also expect for those models to be accessible through conventional configuration interfaces as well?
that
as
had never
persistent
been
data.
a
Okay, so
goal.
that's outside the scope. Okay, fine.
Maybe there are people who want, there are some of the models we've worked on where people have said explicitly, they want to reuse those models in more conventional
Sure,
ways.
so that's fine, but that's not your intention.
That,
I would still
that's
think.
not the
we should mark
ephemeral
those
data
as
store's
config true.
intention.
Yeah, so the question is slightly the other way around is, if you have those models, are you stating explicitly they should not be done via conventional configuration? Are they specifically, they should only be used dynamically? Because that's slightly different, because the moment config tree is looking like it might mean it can be done conventionally. Not it has to be.
Rather than trying to say that, I would say, anything, you can look at anything, I mean, any model can be looked at and say, does it apply? Is it the right thing to do in some other context?
Mhm.
We do this all the time.
Yep.
I don't think it's for us to say, well, no, you could never configure this. There are models where it will be obvious that the data it depends on is dynamic data, and you would never be able to practically configure it.
That is just fine.
which
But
is
that's
fine.
not our
That's
desire
not
to,
we're not worrying about that piece of the problem.
if we said that in the past, you sent us home with that question and we went and did a lot of discussions and decided, nope, that's not a constraint we have to work on. So if you heard me or someone else say that, your questions really got us to dig and say, nope, wherever people use our models, they use our models. Then they gotta define their data stores and define what they want. We've got two basic models, ribbon topology. We know that they'll work with ephemeral. We know that if people are careful, they might work with config. That's their thing. because they're already doing it. Hate to say, they're ahead of us.
Right, so taking the static route example, writing a route through the rib is not the same thing as configuring a static route. Those are
Yes.
two different things. Even though they may be implemented the same in some implementations, they're not implemented the same in other implementations. From a routing protocol's person's perspective, when someone types I2RS blah, blah, blah on some configuration, that is not the same as inserting something in the rib. That's configuring a static route. Inserting something in the rib is something the routing protocol does. That's a different, mentally, that's a different thing.
The place where it comes down to the breakdowns is this. Config true has to apply to the entire hierarchy. You can't, down in the middle of a city state, put something as config true. Your entire hierarchy has to.
So if you say config false up the top, it's all config false.
So if you have a fib or a traditional grid, which is state, is not right. If you have those models, you can't down at the bottom say, here's something I want to fill with. So I'll make it config true.
The models we're building are config true.
Yeah.
As in terms of the model, the higher levels of the model structure.
That's the only place where I want to be real crisp about.
No, your question's about us, or do you think our stuff is?
The whole model would have to be config true.
The whole model's config.
Yeah. But there may be config false leads.
The thing
Yeah, there may
is,
be
you check
config
whoever's
false.
doing the root stuff. There is operational state at the very bottom that says this
Well,
route.
Let me try to give you an example. I have a route that I've learned somehow. Let's not even worry about how I've learned it. The route has been learned, or I've installed it, or whatever, through config true, through I2RS, through BGP, whatever it is. There's a MAC header rewrite that is used to carry the packets for that particular destination over an individual link. 99% of the time, probably 100% of the time, that is going to be config false because you're not going to rewrite the MAC header from I2RS. You might rewrite the next hop, you might rewrite the route itself, right? But the primary tree is going to be config true, but there may be some individual leaf here and there that simply, it's local state, there's no way for a controller to know what that local state would look like. And there's no reason for there's no reason for and if the controller overwrites it, you're probably not doing a good thing.
This is where I said we had to talk about in my original draft, the defaults case, because when you read RESTCOMP and some of the defaults, what happens, it reads like the same thing. What do you do when you have a route and this route is got a next hop, IP next hop, but it's installed with a MAC address that goes out. That can't be musked with. It's just operational state that it got put in with a particular MAC. That Ethernet interface has a MAC address. How do you handle that in your normal configuration? We can configure a next hop, but we won't, in many cases, be able to configure a MAC because that's tied to an interface. You can't change it because that interface usually is tied to a MAC. You got a board, you stick it in, it's got a MAC address. No, we don't think it's sensible for the basic RIB. Yes, that's how we're planning to do it, and that's what Russ is trying to say. Those are the things.
The RIB itself is config true, but when you get down to these individual leaves, there may be places where
You have operational state.
That's fine.
Right, that is as far as I can tell what you are doing now.
So one thing that came up during the, I guess, routing working group, and I think I sent an email to you on the working list, was the assumption, I think, that when we make config true nodes in a model, does that necessarily mean they're accessible through conventional data stores? So I guess I responded to your statement about that from your slides, and I guess my thinking was that just because you have a data model with config true doesn't necessarily mean it's accessible through conventional data stores. Coming back to what Kent said, we can say this model is only accessible through this data store, this model is only accessible through this data store. We can have models in a router that are accessible through some data stores and not in others. So the I2RS model may only be accessible through the dynamic data store. So if you try to address that model through a conventional data store, you get error.
Right. So this goes back to that decision with the idiom, but assuming that we go with the, I2RS models are with standard config true, then if you really wanted it only to be available in a dynamic or ephemeral data store, then the RFC itself could say so in text, or the Yang module might be able to say so in text, or we might be able to define a new Yang statement of some sort that kind of explicitly states it, but I'm not sure if that's a great idea.
Well, as I mentioned, that was one of my
That was one of the proposals, yes.
but, it's not, with the catalog, this becomes a new point.
Well, also, do we need to limit it? I mean, I2RS can say, for this I2RS draft, it has to be accessible through the dynamic data store. Vendors can make it accessible
That's
other ways
the
if they
point.
want, that data model.
That's what Joel was saying.
Just don't want to restrict it or imply that it must be supported.
Right. So back to that. I haven't read the RIB draft myself, but in the topology draft, I remember it's not intended to only be in the dynamic data store. It actually was intended to be configured standard, and because you want your overlays to survive reconfiguration. This is why we came up with that whole thing with the leaf ref being required instance false, so that if it's referring to something and it's not the reference isn't resolved inside configuration, then the system it's valid configuration, but then the system can go ahead and see, well, can I resolve this leaf ref inside operational state? And if so, then the overlay becomes active.
On mute echo.
Oh, okay, guys.
And the recording, so it's nice to try and use the mics when we can.
Sorry, guys, we should, pass this. We should pass this around when we talk. Okay, more questions, more thoughts on this.
So I still think I think we're on the same page roughly that when you write a model, you write config true in there. That means that you could take this model and use it on conventional configuration. It may be the author's intent to say this doesn't make much sense, and you might put a comment in the model to say it's designed to be used with I2RS, but actually just by it being config true, that does say that somebody could take this model if they wanted to and try and use it through conventional data stores. So and then maybe, as you say, we use Yang library as the mechanism to then make a particular device say whether or not a particular model is available only through dynamic or also through conventional data stores.
Right, and we find the case, what we've been hearing from people is, for example, AC provided an extended RIB to the RTWG. And Louise said to him, why don't you look at the I2RS? He said, but that's ephemeral only. And we said, no, that's a data model.
Yes.
You install it in the data store you want it to be in.
Yeah.
If you want it to go in the config, because it's got some really valid things, then you need to make sure it works in the config. That in the Yang doctors, you might want to, you should look at the model in both ways. So that is the case that Joel mentioned. That is someplace you say, for this data store, we're going to accept this. If someone puts it in the config, they have to make sure they have it working.
So the one thing we want to be careful of here is to do with conformance. I think that to say if it's a device that's choosing which data models are available in which data stores, then that could be quite difficult for clients to handle. There needs to be some way of having sets of modules and things like that. So there's all to do with the packaging and library things, but there's an open issue, I think, here.
So if we have the models that can be either one, Joel, did you have something you wanted to say about this?
The thing is, we have only a relatively small number of models, and at the moment, all of them that we're doing, by definition, we're doing them because we want to support them in the ephemeral data store. And we certainly, while some boxes may choose to support them in the conventional data store, we certainly do not expect that all boxes will. So from our perspective, in terms of the current work, we have to treat it as, if you're supporting this, it's because you're supporting it here. Now, in principle, you could have a box that only supported it somewhere else, only supported it in the conventional, but we're not trying to solve that. But we would not want to have the situation because we wrote it for ephemeral, that boxes who are supporting the model were required to support it for config. That would overly limit the work and the use of the work.
Yeah, and that all sounds fine. And that all sounds fine and pragmatic. And I think that's even it's just a description statement or comment in the model saying this is how it's envisaged to be used. I think that's
Okay, so we can put, again, that's something as these models are going through the final gang doctors, you should say, put it in. Because we're happy to do that. Questions before we go back to we're just staying on these and then I'm going to go to the next set of pages of questions.
Well, it's along these lines. I guess one question I had based on the new data stores draft. So we've defined a new edit data RPC. So the RIB model, for example, has RPCs defined for adding and removing things. I don't think the topology draft has that. So if we go to the RIB model, you could use RPCs to add and remove them. But I guess it's a question for the community. Are we also intending to use edit data with a target of OR ephemeral or DS ephemeral to write to those data models, or just the RPCs? So that's one thing.
Well, the topology model, I think, is expecting to be able to do edit data.
Because it doesn't have RPCs.
Right.
But then I wonder, why are we doing RPCs then for the RIB model?
Okay, and that was based on initial feedback for some of the early implementers. Pardon? And speed, right. And that was the next statement, is the early implementers said RPCs are going to give us better speed.
I can kind of see that because implementation can go, oh, this is this RPC, direct it right.
Right, that's exactly
instead
what.
of looking at where it belongs in a data store. But that's something definitely want to clarify, is that, okay, we're not intending to use the new edit data, or the edit data is allowed, or whatever. Like.
So at this point, and again, we're in this last minute call and Mark's sitting there, we should say at this point, with this revision, we're intending to do RPCs, and Mark, you need to
Okay,
work
and what
on
about
that.
reading from the data store? Because reading from operational will give you the operational values, and for sure we should be able to read this data model in the operational data store.
Yes.
But are you intending to be able to read the OR ephemeral data store and read to read this data?
The RPCs are only right.
Yeah, they're only right today. So I'm just wondering, do you
Then
want
you
to
have
do
your
a,
answer.
do you want to do a get data on this data store or not? Just something we'll need to clarify.
Are you, Mark, the get data?
No, get data. So there's there's edit data and then there's get data, which would just get.
be able to read the routes.
Well, you'll be able to get them from the operational data store.
In current version, there have some, for example, the RIB add, RIB delete, and root add and root delete, something like that.
So, I lost my, okay. Hand me one back and we'll share one. Here, you stay up here and we'll share. The question he's asking is, are you going to get the results from the operational data store or from
Actually,
the,
let me rephrase a little bit.
yeah,
So obviously you'll be able to query this data model from the operational data store, and that'll give you the operational view of everything in that data tree, the config true and the config false nodes. For the config true nodes, are you expecting to be able to do a get data from the OR, from the DS ephemeral data store? I'm not sure if there's a reason. I don't know the protocol well enough to know if what you write to the dynamic data store.
think of it as rest.
I know, but what you write to the ephemeral data store, is there some reason that wouldn't exactly get translated to the operational, or the other things that could overwrite it or something?
Well, I mean, there should be no lag between the operational. The only concern I have is the view that you need to be able to get at all of the pieces of data. As long as you can get at all of them, I don't think it causes a problem for us if the reads need to be aimed at the operational data store instead of the ephemeral store. Make the code look a little odd to some people, but that's a perfectly reasonable thing. I had normally simply assumed that one would read back from the same data store one wrote to, because I tend to think that way, but it doesn't hurt anything if it.
Well, I mean,
That is what he asked.
kind of. I mean, we're using RPCs to write. It's a question of whether we ever read the data store. Because to be honest,
You
if
need
we
to be
never,
able to read it.
if we never read the data, if we only read the operational for this data, maybe let me back up a little bit. At one point, you guys are talking about panes of glass and resolution. Is that all gone away? There's only one. There's only a single ephemeral data store.
Yeah.
It's a global that every.
There's
client
only
wants
one
the same
ephemeral data store.
Last writer wins.
Yeah.
So then
Well,
anything.
there's a priority mechanism. It's not always last writer wins.
Okay.
But last successful writer is the only one who
You
won.
only keep one copy of the data.
Yeah.
Which means it'll be that same copy very shortly in the operational.
Yeah.
Then there's probably not a strong need to read from this data store using get data, which actually kind of means to me you have RPCs to write. You're never going to read from it. I'm not sure there's a data store there.
Well, at least the way topology
There's
is done
an
it is
origin,
just
but-
to read and write that data store.
Yeah.
And I don't have a strong preference on it.
Okay, the reason we did this is we're trying to have a very simple beginning. There is still an open issue, depending on working group effort and desire, to come back to the panes of glass. But right now, we're just trying to get there. That was our statement. So,
I'm not trying to conclude. I'm just raising some
no,
questions.
no,
before we want to-
this was just simply a clarifying answer, hopefully. But, so did that get to the end of your question?
Well, it's more, we'll have to decide what we want to do there. It doesn't sound like we've necessarily concluded. And it's a good point that I have to think about how this might get extended. And also the topology model doesn't have RPCs, so that one's a bit different.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, okay.
I'm sorry. I thought Jason was going.
Did you have any more comments you wanted to make on the model? Okay.
So I thought where Jason was going with that line of questioning was that, you know, if you're going to do get data on the DS ephemeral data store, then it'd be asymmetric if you weren't also able to do the edit data. I mean, there may be RPCs, but it'd be asymmetric. I don't think you're going to prevent the ability for edit data. It's going to be possible. The RPCs are just an optimization. But then I have a question of the value of the RPCs. I mean, that seems more like an implementation detail that could be optimized, you know, away, hopefully enough, maybe not enough. I'm not the expert here with your performance requirements, but I mean, it'd be unfortunate if there was a need to define the RPC to get that last microsecond of performance. Then,
Does the RPC data show up in the ephemeral database? That's the real question.
Does the RPC data show up in the database?
If I do an RPC, does that, if I do an RPC to does that show up in the ephemeral database?
Well, it
Yes.
shows up in operational. My question is, can you do a get data and see it in DS?
We have generally assumed you
Could do that. That was our assumption and that was our desire.
So you have an RPC whose side effect is creating data in the operation.
That's correct.
No, in the ephemeral.
In the ephemeral data store.
which by the way is actually seems to be against the common way that we're approaching this, that the RPCs are really only affecting the operational.
This is the rib for the topology.
No. For in general, for NetConf and RESTConf in general, all RPCs only affect operational.
RPCs can affect configuration, no doubt.
Oh, okay.
The constraints are resolved in the operation. But the RPC itself is
Yes.
anything on box.
Okay, sorry, that's my.
No, but it is true. It's a little bit funny to have these custom RPCs for these things.
Right.
I mean, the thing is, the fact that you're writing to this data store is already going to alert the router that you're doing something special for I2RS. So maybe that's going to be optimized to that already. Only there's a certain number of places it has to go in the app layer.
I think it goes the opposite, because I'm having to do the RPC, I try to, because I have to do the RPC, and then. Because I have to do the RPC and then go ahead and create the thing in the ephemeral database, I'm not really optimizing. You know, I actually have to do more work, because now I have to tell it, as I'm making the operational database, don't let that impact the daemons who would traditionally look at the ephemeral database. So it's a mixed optimization. But my question, and I thought your question as well, was does data created by the RPC show up in the ephemeral database? And the answer is yes.
So one thing that you have to be aware of, if you write an RPC and you hardwire it to a specific data store, it's hardwired to a specific data store, right? By doing that, you won't be able to use the same module to implement it in a conventional data store or whatever, because the RPC is hardwired to modify a specific dynamic data store, right? So if you look at edit data, it passes the data store as part of a parameter into it. And
So you don't have that mechanism.
That would argue that we need to have both if people are going to do multiple. But again, as Joel said, our focus was ephemeral and the high throughput constraints for the RIP. The topology is in
So
the
if
other
we,
one.
if we ever wanted the RPCs to be used in other data stores, I mean, someone could also augment them to add a target, in theory, if we wanted to change it to be able to use another data source. But if you're doing this stuff through conventional data stores, you're probably not looking for the high speed optimization anyways.
Why should the RPC be any quicker than an edit data on the dynamic data store?
I'll let Mark go.
Because we haven't, I don't think we've expressed any constraints as to what happens. So
I think maybe just a preference for some implementers. Maybe it's preferred to use RPC. Another way, you use the classical get and put, something like that.
In theory, you can direct that right to the app
Yeah.
that cares about it.
So I think the recommendation would be to not define the RPCs in the base RIB model, but to allow those to be defined in another model, another RFC actually, that, potentially augments the model.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the traditional edit data and get data would work, maybe not the highest performance, but for, it would probably get you off the ground and satisfy most use cases. And then with experience and discover the RPCs are faster, we certainly could augment them in later.
That can come at this point, I'm sorry, well, that can come at this point in the game doctor's recommendations. I don't, as long as it's an augmentation that can go back to the original design.
Yeah, although deciding on RPCs or not, I'm not sure so much a Yang doctor thing. I mean, it's kind of, this community has to decide whether there's some reason to have those RPCs.
No, Giles is not here. So if you, you may want to talk together as a group of game doctors on the recommendation. We'll take a recommendation like that as far, I have to send it to the working group, but I do not see anything at this point that says if it's just an augmentation that we put together that equals the same thing. I don't see any problem with that as a chair. And neither does Russ. I mean, we're glad to send that back to the working group.
I think I'm keying off of Jürgen's comment where the RPC would be locked down to a specific data store presumably, and that's unfortunate because people may want to move around to other data stores. So if the base model did not define their RPCs, then the flexibility to move around would be there, but then the other, module would be there, but that's optional to implement, and of course you get targeted specifically to your ephemeral data.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
All right, sorry, that helped to the ground.
Guys, Mark is the lead author, so you're talking to the right place.
Yeah. Great, have it.
We should probably take it to the list though about this RPC thing, just to make sure that not someone's probably about that optimization.
Yes, we'll take it to the list. Let's make sure our game doctor I want to make sure that when we take it to the list, the game doctors and the authors agree, and then we'll just go ahead and. And the doctor. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I know, I'm almost Dr. Sue. I'm working toward that. These are just a couple other minor things that I don't know where they go in the data store, so if we could just spend a moment.
Sorry, maybe before we move to your next topic, I just wanted to sort of, Joel was talking about the priorities and the one dynamic or one ephemeral data store. I mean, I think the implementation details for how this is going to be done are still in play. And in my mind, or at least the way I was thinking about it, there might truly be a data store called DS ephemeral.
Yes.
But then there also might be, in addition to that, there might be something like DS ephemeral 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yes.
Where those are representing panes of glass.
Right. I was going to say that is actually an implementation
Yeah, that's
detail
what I'm saying.
that doesn't really even need to be in the draft, right? All right, don't give me that.
No, the I2RS would have to define all this, but they.
The I2RS documents say you don't remember it, it doesn't come back. If you want to store it somewhere for information, that's fine. The device can store anything it wants to know. But the important property is the current property that the application can know about is this is what's there. If my thing gets overwritten, I get an error, and I don't have to worry about whether my thing will reappear by magic at some later point in time. It's gone. So there's no, as far as I2RS application to what is in operation.
Yeah, it's a slightly different question. I think it's-
And there's only one pane of glass for that model, which
Yeah.
is what the document calls.
Yes, I know. The reason I went to this slide was actually that very question. No, Kent, you might want to stay there. It's a fairly easy. When I said we had to discuss edit collision, Andy did a fairly good job of describing in the edit collision, because this is what we're doing. We're having edit collisions, right? Andy said on this stuff, calls it edit collisions. The entity tag is used to handle edit collisions. The only thing that's different with I2RS's requirements is if you have a collision and you lose, you have to send an event. That's it. I don't know how to express that in a data store, but that's part of the what do we do to design. It is really for RESTconf edit condition. I figured if we could get the RESTconf now, so this entity tag can be broken up between client ID and priority or client reference ID. I mean, Andy you guys thought carefully about that. So that's why this is here. So does that help at all? That is one of the I2RS sticking points that we've long had, but I thought in net RESTconf we did it.
Oh, sorry, I'm walking up to the whiteboard.
Good.
Mike for a second. Sorry.
Yeah, the camera's over at the whiteboard. I guess I didn't put it in the pink square.
Okay, so what I'm trying to draw here is the subset of the tree diagram that you find inside the ephemeral, the revised data store draft. And in there, it has an arrow that says dynamic data stores can feed into operational. And so then, you might think that there'd just be one dynamic data store I2RS would define, but I'm proposing as an implementation detail, you might actually define, let's say you have 8 panes of glass, so define 9 data stores, 8 of them being the specific one for each pane of glass, 1 of them being your resolution area, right? So then you would say, okay, so, however you want to do it, users or priorities, they're actually interacting with these guys. But then behind the scenes, there's logic that does the distillation. And then that is what's being fed into operational.
The point I was making is, I don't care if you store it in 9 different data stores or 400 different data stores. But if A writes the stuff and gets success, and then B writes the stuff and gets success, and there's a collision, and A gets told your stuff is gone, when B goes and deletes his stuff, A's stuff better not reappear. Don't reinstall it. Now, normally if I see N of those, it looks to me like they're going to intend to cause reinstallation, and that's why I'm reacting.
Right.
As long as it doesn't reinstall, I don't care what happens.
Right, so that could be your implementation logic, how you're doing that. So if you discover that collision, then some of your logic could be to remove the values from the data store. So it's gone.
As long as it's gone, I don't care how it's implemented.
Right.
So going back to the other piece over here, that's why we have both the definition of the edit tag, and we just have to pick a number of bits. The edit tag is currently.
I guess, Joel, just another clarification on that. I believe you would also expect that even if there's 8 or 9 data stores, anything when you read from operational has a single origin.
Yes.
One point to this, that this is not actually just an implementation detail. You have to say that which is the target data store you want to write. And do you want to say that I write to DS1, DS2, DS3?
Personally, I would expect to be writing to ds.e, not ds.e1, but
And the only reason I'm proposing that you might be writing to 1, 2, or 3 is because otherwise you'd have to introduce extensions to RESTconf, or, how do you specify the priorities? There'd be some extension, but right, but if you map priorities onto data stores, then you kind of get it for free with the existing protocols, and that's the reason why I'm suggesting.
I got to go back to number 1. Entity tags can have the space inside of them to store a client reference. If you break the entity tag, just for a minute, break the number of bits in half. Half of it stores a client ID, half of it stores a priority, right? If you just compare If you just compare on the priority bits, if the client's different, you compare on the priority bits. If the client's the same, if the priority bits are the high order, you can do the comparison. That was the discussion with Andy in the creation of the entity tag, is if you're encoding that, you can encode it in a way that the priority.
it's actually even better than that. If you put the priority in the high order bits, you just compare the two things.
Yes.
And the entity tag, the real entity tag, just serves as the tiebreaker, because he observed that if you really just make these unique, then you don't have a collision. You don't have to worry about what if two things have the same effective priority. And so we avoid that. And the point is, I don't want to require that people be writing to their individual data stores. That would be really a painful requirement.
So that's what we're.
Yeah, no, I think I understand your proposal. And this might be workable. I think within the context of the ephemeral data store, you may be able to redefine the meaning of the entity tag. Yes. But I just want to share with you that it's desirable that the E tag value for, say, running, if your system only supports running and it gets committed to operational, the E tag value for running and operational would hopefully be the same. So a client could very quickly, like with a single comparison of E tag comparisons, see that actually, my system is completely, the applied is in fact the same as intended.
I would expect, at least in most cases, I won't swear there's not a corner case, that this E tag that was used on the dynamic data store would be the one you would see in the operational. The fact that operational doesn't worry about collision resolution doesn't cause us any problem with saying, but you can't use that E tag. You can still use that E tag.
So I actually don't think it'll be the same in operational, because the operational data store will undoubtedly also have configuration from traditional conventional data stores, and therefore the E tag value will not be the same as what it would be just for the dynamic.
So my point was actually different. I think in some of the I2RS drafts, I've read about how you look at the dynamic configuration coming through dynamic, and it compares to the stuff coming through intended and has some sort of priority resolution between those two.
Yeah.
Is that still intended?
Yes.
So my question is, how's that going to be handled?
Well, I can't swear how it will be handled, but I know what the last time I was working closely on that question, you'd have a configured value, not an ephemeral value, that was the effective priority of the config store. And so you have essentially a priority string that applies to that. And so you then compare the priorities across those two. That's because otherwise you get this complete uncertainty about what's going on.
So does that mean you have the intended configuration effectively feeding into dynamic?
So the idea is that, yes, that the dynamic data store, when you go to apply something, it checks, was this created by CLI or similar conventional config with a higher priority than you, the client, have? If so, you lose. You don't get to do it. Okay. Because I'm not a Yang person, I cheated. I said, it should look, and it doesn't, it can find the real data under the covers. Because if it's already existing in the dynamic, then it doesn't have to look at static, because if the nuke thing beats the dynamic thing, then and the dynamic thing beat config, then transitivity saves my neck. But if there's nothing in dynamic, then you have to check that you're actually allowed to override config.
If you assign, just to say, if priority 1 is low and 200 is high, if you assign dynamic at 1 to 1, this is just one example, 1 to 100, and config to 101 to 250, config would always overwrite, right? And in which case, only if you had a dynamic case without a config case would it win. If you flip it, right, then, yeah, and those were the two cases the architecture tried to write in generic form.
Very separate from the way data model that conventional.
Correct. Yes.
You're talking about config from other models that end up in the RIB.
Yep. Data in the RIB that's.
It came from indirectly from other.
Yeah.
And other.
But, well.
Locally configured like a static route.
Yeah.
Typically.
Priority versus information learned for right protocols.
It's.
Well, all the systems do have that.
Yes.
How does its priority sit against this?
You can't change what's dynamically learned.
Well,
But you can change the next hop for a route that was.
Yeah, you can actually.
Yep.
You can have a BGP.
I've even.
You could have a BGP route learn, and then you use I2RS to install a route in the RIB that overrides the BGP route. Or you could actually do it the other way around. You want to be able to do it the other way around, which is you want to be able to have the BGP route override unless the BGP route goes away for some reason.
Yes, but that example's a RIB example where basically I2RS, the information comes from the dynamic data store, is the equivalent of a protocol, a routing protocol, in terms of it has an admin preference and competes in the RIB for what gets installed based on the admin preference, not based on any. Right, that's a local admin preference kind of thing.
That's a config option on the router. That's not something that's done like on a per route.
Yeah. So is that in your data model somewhere?
This is just how RIBs work. I mean,
His question is still valid.
yes, it is. No, it is. I don't think there's an admin distance anywhere, and that would have to not be in the RIB model. That would have to be in the config model someplace, right? That would be something that you configure on the RIB itself.
Yeah. Can I just go back to a question from what Sue put up there? So you've used a range in both those cases. Is it not the case that for the conventional configuration there'd just be a single priority value for all of that?
Well.
That's my expectation. I suppose somebody could have an implementation where they had multiple, but I don't know why they would ever do so.
So it's a single value, and you know, and that's configured, and you know through the dynamic system what that value is. Presume it's a simple check as to when you're writing to it whether you're above or below that value. That's a fine.
But going back, we had a question before about where this resolution happens and what data stores you see the various information in. So I assume that whatever's written through the I2RS protocol, you're going to see if you do a get data on the DS ephemeral, even if and this goes back to my question earlier, even though that entry may not make it into operational because config overrode it or.
That's right.
Okay, so then going back to that, we definitely need to be able to read
Yes.
the DS ephemeral because you may get a different value in there than you read from operational.
Yes, so go back to our
Okay.
original thing, scrub the answer and put that answer. And which makes Jürgen's comment even more important.
And then intended would only have what's configured through conventional interfaces before resolution of the priorities. Yeah.
So my question is, where do we define this different split? Is that in the data store? Is that in the addition to RESTConf? This is a very simple answer, but I couldn't quite figure out where you'd say, and our normal standardized split between these is this. Or does it need to be flexible for customers?
Sorry. My first question would be that where do you carry this priority information in RESTConf?
This particular example comes from RESTConf. This is the edit config entity tag for RESTConf.
How do you know what is the priority of that specific edit config request? Where is that information carried?
Client is mapped to a
Okay.
priority. You have a table.
Okay.
You have a table that is either statically configured or updated through something like Radius, because that's secure from some server, but it's pre-set up, it's a priori. And so you know client ID to priority. You could simply have client and priority, but in case your client changes the priority in the middle, this is my proposal. Joel and I have debated whether you just need a client ID or whether you need a priority, but we need to have that discussion, make a decision, and go on. But see, if you have a client ID and it always has the same priority, then you just keep the client. The question is, if something dynamically comes in and changes it, what do you do about the decision? Joel says, oh, well, the next time someone comes in, you have a different priority. I'm not as happy with that. I like storing it.
Well, I like actually being explicit about the priority and the client ID, even though I think the priority is stable for any given client, because that lets us use some nice clean value for client ID that is not necessarily tied to the assigned priority, which changes. If I have a client, it's got the same ID all the time, but Radius tells me what priority it has, and the server checks, is he using this priority he's allowed to use? If he does something with a priority he's not allowed to use, no. Now, whether we allow a range or the value he's allowed to use is always one value, different debate.
But my point is, back to the data store definition. This is the entity tag. We're just, the cleanest way seemed to be split the entity tag into two fields and say, for I2RS, it's going to have these two fields. One's priority, one's client. They're integer fields or something. Where would you put that if we had it? First of all, does that sound reasonable? And second of all, where would we define it? Is it in RESTConf? Is it in the data store?
So I'm not entirely sure if it is reasonable. If you look to the HTTP RFC and the definition of the E tag and what it means, I'm pretty sure it has to do with the representation of the state, regardless of how the state was written, how it came to be, And so I'm not entirely sure.
And
this is
every time you
appropriate.
entity tag, you write it. When I talked to Andy about it, he said, yeah, that's reasonable, split in half.
Yeah.
It's just a number. It's an opaque value. If we then go beyond that opaque value and say, by the way, your opaque value has two sub-opaque values in it.
Right. No. What I'm trying to say though is, okay, so let's say there's an E tag value. The data has been written by one client, and an E tag value is calculated using your approach. And then let's say the system reboots, so it's wiped clean. Another client comes in, different priority, and they write the exact same data. In your approach, that'd be a different E tag, but I'm thinking that it's actually the same state. It's the same data. Therefore, I would think that maybe it'd be the same E tag. So that's the thing I'm worried about.
I'm sorry. If we defined if they have the same client ID and they have
That's not what he's asking. He says, if two different clients, client A wrote it at time 1, it's got an E tag. Client A went away, he died. Client B came back and tried to write it. The exact same data. In fact, either client B has a higher priority or he has a lower priority. If he has a lower priority, even though he's not changing any of the data, he'll actually get an error. If he has a higher priority, he is replacing it with the same content, but it gets his E-tag because that's now, actually conceptually, the data's changed. It now has this priority associated with it. So I think it's reasonable to view it as it's not actually the same data, even if all of the fields look the same. So I think it's a reasonable, yes, it's bending the E-tags, but I think it's a reasonable stretch.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, maybe you can redefine that.
I grant you it's a stretch.
It is a stretch, but
So are we talking about HTTP e-tags?
Yeah.
I think they're handed out by the server and they're opaque and you shouldn't change them, mess around with that. You shouldn't overload this.
Well, but we're telling the server what to hand out. This is the server that we're telling is going to use this E-tag.
HTTP spec just says it's a looping string. Without any definition, it just says that as long as the values are the same, you should generate the same key.
The point, Jürgen, is we're talking about what the server is going to use as the E-tag that he's associating with the data. So that it's a way, all it is a hack. And frankly, if you can give us another hack, we don't care. We know it's a hack so that we can associate the priority and the client ID with the data.
So, I mean, my understanding of the architecture is you have a client coming in, the client is mapped to a priority, right? And a priority is used once you merge conventional config, ephemeral config together.
It's also used between ephemerals. It's not just with the merger. Between ephemeral clients. So you have to associate the priority with the data in the ephemeral data store somehow. And we said we want to associate the client ID with the data in the ephemeral store for traceability. So the suggestion that we were given was to use the E-tag. If you want to give us a different suggestion, I don't think anybody is hung up. We just need a way to associate this with the data. Yeah.
could be metadata. You started with that. We really just want, that's why this issue is here. We just want an example of how you'd like us to do it and where to put it, you know, whether it's in a REST comp or whether it's in a data store definition.
Nope. This was a big debate we were working through. Some folks wanted to move, they said, we ended up saying no, no.
So, to answer some of the questions, I don't think it should go in the data stores architecture draft because I think this is specific to I2RS and not dynamic data stores in general. I don't know about the protocol updates, it's a different question. The one thing on the E-tag that I'm still confused about is that if the E-tag's meant to be a sort of effectively almost like a hash of what the current data is, then I think you might not have enough information in the E-tag you're generating here, because has it not got to represent a hash of, for a given subtree of everything that's below it? Whereas isn't this E-tag going to represent the last thing that was written to that subtree? So I think you might have to split it up maybe into, if you do the scheme of having some priority, some client, and some hash of the subtree, maybe?
My understanding is that in RESTCOM, the E-tag changes when the content of the whole data store changes. Right? It's not a specific entry in some RIP that got changed by client XYZ. So you, yeah, and then there you get into trouble. I think you already have additional metadata, and you probably need to be explicit about it. You also need to be explicit about when the mapping happens and what happens if things change. So is client to priority mapping something that is static at the point it's written?
If E-tags won't work, then we need something else.
We're glad to change.
We really don't care.
But I'm incredibly grateful because if we have to change and it has to be in the data model or something, then now's it. You know, we should do something. If it goes in a metadata model, I hope it's better. But
so the one at the top is always going to be continuously changing on every update. Every configuration update.
Yeah. So I think this multi-headed control is the only thing that's preventing this work. You know, like this is the effort that in how to do the prioritization and how to. This is it, right? This is the only.
The multi-headed and the validation. Those are the two.
what about the validation? Well, anyway, I'll hold that for a second. But anyway, I'm just saying that this is the hardest part. I mean, if you were to take it on as a working group item and you spun on it for a whole month or 3 months or whatever, I mean, that is this.
This is the whole
conversation
thing.
If it weren't for this, it'd be sailing straight through. So, I mean, you're asking us sort of on the spot to come up with a different answer.
No, we're
but
just.
we
All
will.
we're doing is telling you, we're told this one would work. You guys are saying, actually, we see problems, which is good feedback.
Excellent.
I'm saying check into it. Look,
Help coming up with our brains.
I would say, let's verify with the HP RFC the definition of ETAG and what does it really mean? Is there, does it have a wiggle room in it? Just make sure we're not violating it in any way.
Yeah.
And if we're not, then I think you'd be okay to continue. It might be difficult from implementation's perspective, right? Because a generic RESTconf server, you could imagine the infrastructure and its ETAG calculation mechanism. I guess it would have to be able to do the same for the dynamic data stores, but then kind of prefix it with, so it does the same hashing calculation, and then it does a prefix with, client and priority or something like this. But it would just be a little bit different from an infrastructure perspective.
But Jürgen's point is made. This tag goes on isn't then rewriting the whole data store. It's just the one thing that's being rewritten.
So with an ETAG, it bubbles up to the root of the tree. So you modify an ETAG somewhere low down the tree, some leaf, it'll modify that ETAG and everything up to the root of the tree every time.
That's actually that's actually probably a positive.
Okay.
Because imagine somebody wrote some leaf at certain priority.
Yeah.
And somebody went and tried to rewrite the entire data store.
Yeah, then you get.
You would actually like the fact that, oh, you're going to see the same priority from the last guy who won. Now, there's a little weirdness. We may not see the highest priority. It's not going to produce the right result in any case. I think we don't care how it ripples up. That's because it's not going to ripple up right no matter what we do. Rippling up, you're going to have to check all the subfields.
I think you just said it, but let me restate it to make sure I understand. So you have a container with 2 leaves, and client A writes leaf A with priority 1, client B writes leaf B with priority 2.
Yeah.
What does the container's priority be?
The way we've defined things, the collision is on the individual fields.
No,
So you have to check the individual fields you're writing.
My question is, I know how to calculate the ETAG, assuming we're to go this approach. I know how to calculate the ETAG for leaf A. I know how to calculate the ETAG for leaf B. But then how do I bubble it up to the container? That's,
I think the answer is yes, this has to get answered, but I think that is not going to break whether this works for this or not. Because if it ripples up, it ripples up. So there is a value that is well defined, so you know what you're getting. But that's not the value that's used for the comparison to check for things. It will almost never tell somebody the right thing that they want to know about, is this whole data store still the same? But
We would even have a hash.
Did you want to, I'm sorry, did you want to?
No, I just tried.
It's fine, okay. Keep going. Just be polite.
I'm gonna diverge and think. I was just thinking back to you saying where does this get written to? Whatever the answer is, I'll say not the data source draft because it's dynamic. Actually, I've gone to the conclusion. I think probably not the RESTconf updates for NMDA because we want that to progress quickly because we want to get that. So I think it's another draft that's augmenting RESTconf, probably whatever the solution. Well, maybe whatever the solution is. Whether that's in I2RS or in NetConf is I don't know.
It's definitely an I2RS working group. That's the discussion that a draft should be adopted.
This is all about I2RS
Right.
coming through. The question is it a data store? What you're telling me, it's really a RESTconf draft like I started out writing. This, you're talking about that this has to be an augmentation. I'm sorry, I should do that. Is this, what I'm hearing? Okay, we don't have to do that. Okay, I don't know how to turn it off, but it's there. So.
Were there any more slides you wanted to show?
No, I mean, there's I can talk the rest, there's validation, and we have, if we pull in something from someone else, how do we validate, and there's this issue, and that's basically the 2 issues we've always sort of stuck on.
So again, going back to which draft, if it's something specific tags, then that's a question.
Yes.
Well,
It's a theme, but it could be in their draft that's updating the rest of the.
Yes, but it's in a draft that updates the
Right.
rest.
Oh, so true.
So where that, where you were saying that is it data store, I asked the question is this a more generic solution or is this a process? So I don't know if there's any intention to use network at all for I2RS or is it really a rest of
At this point, we're solving this for rest of the charters that we had to solve it for both. That is again up to how we do it. But I figure once we get one going, we'll learn something. Because all of this is pretty, and we'll come back and do net count, and if we have to grab it, then we have to grab it. I don't know how to take, I don't know how to break more than just a little bit at a time.
I think that when you're defining the data store, you could put there that propagation rules actually involve how you create index, how it goes up, and that is valuable for that. If you want to store the priorities in index, then you don't need to store them, you just automatically.
Less than create metadata.
It's metadata. You create separate metadata. That's
And then
solving all the issues. And I looked up the RESTCOM spec, it seems they have a data store, that packet configuration lead source tag, and the local data store lead tags, they actually have a lot of them. The problem is that you actually want to find via an RPC, which means you don't really have a fully funded resource. You have an RPC that's, as a side effect, creating or deleting resources. And so then the ETAC is, by side effect, go somewhere, or has by side effect, or something. If you would do added data, that probably wouldn't exist, because it would actually go and find a resource. So there are a number of trade-offs to consider, right? So, and it's important that you understand if we do that, has implications on a number of other things that we can do. So we have to find ways to untangle that and find out probably what looks like a good optimization in isolation or not so.
That's from all your comments you've made over the time, that was my understanding. Let me go on. We haven't even touched about, is it worthy for me to try to find hold the next session? No. On Thursday, is it willing to be
I think we kind of talked about it. Oh, maybe just want to quickly talk about validation.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I understand the front and ask your doctor, otherwise I'll let go. Or I'll find another. But thank you very much for the input. Those are the two things we worked on. Prioritization, multi-headed, and validation.
So you asked earlier, could you have to work with this? That's clear. So there's a site, there's school aspect and school aspect, but I'm not. I'm not interested in writing.
Yeah, I'm not the same boat, and I was going to make a comment that, you know, the active people were the, you know, 3 plus Aaliyah left, but, you know, one of you guys are, I mean, the obvious, I don't know, editors, or depending on words, we had no one else in this room was talking, right?
Yeah, and that's something I have.
All of us were basically NMDA authors plus Jason Stern, and I don't know if you think.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we started all of this challenge with is, you know, if we're going to go forward, that's got to get an author. But I'll call for the authors and I'll lay the 2 points because we really have to make this entity, which is a REST contract, and the validation, which I think is a data store issue or not. I mean, that's the thing we have to solve. If you pull something in from config, what validation do you make? How does this data store validate?
It's probably entirely up to you.
Yes, that's the point. Someone has to sit and say, this is the way to do it.
Yeah, I think we've got free reign. So
Is that fit, just so I understand, is that fit in the data store definition, or is that in the second paragraph about the validation?
I didn't see the definition of your I2RS.
Correct.
So in the sort of text above the data store, I describe how it works.
I think so.
Okay, so in that boilerplate section, it says that the dynamic data store, that the RFC needs to specify all the semantics and syntax and behaviors of the new data store, including turning on and off, protocol specific stuff. Like if you're using netconf and locks don't make sense, you say, okay, we're using netconf and locks don't make sense. You can turn off stuff and add stuff, you can do whatever you want.
So, okay, but we don't really need the end syntax, we just sort of specify it in the boilerplate.
Yeah, you can do text and just fine.
Okay, then I think we're good.
So the one other thing then is the data source we define. Am I right thinking this is the I2RS federal dynamic data store? It's not more generic as I2RS or I2RS. It's I2RS specific.
Again, the same reason that how can you do something when you didn't build up the other constraints? I've started narrowing my scope to, this is what we're doing based on this stuff. Everything else, if someone wants to build it, we go for it.
No, that's fine. That's what I want to hear is this I2RS federal.
This is I2RS ephemeral, which is why,
It is fine.
and if you keep ephemeral and dynamic data store, equivalent words, someone else will create jokes.
Yeah, exactly. That's fine.
Well, the case in point, Jennifer already has dynamic data stores.
Yeah.
And they have their own behaviors and stuff like that, so.
So,
That
yeah,
would-
that's all
it's
we're
not
on.
gonna change.
I was just checking the statement.
No, we're not trying to go beyond a very, a functional sort of standard. And I hope once the companies come up with interesting stuff like this, or we're wanting to do.
Street GPP was asking for Yang advice. They have a lot of network automation.
Again, that could be another dynamic data store. And it has to, okay, I think that's not what I need, I just gotta get a offer. Keep going. Okay. Thank you both all.
You get the socialist, you get the social. That one is. Kafka Museum.
All right. How far are we? Right. Would you text him?
I haven't talked to him. He said he was coming down here